These two were already the Bible. We're still in the patriarchal age, and I've drawn it out of proportion because this 2,500 years here from creation, as you can count the lives of people in the Bible, add them up till we come to Mount Sinai. There was no written law. This is the reason we're studying it this way. There was no written law back there. God spoke to the heads of households. We call that a family religion. The only way we know about it is because here, 2,500 years later, Moses wrote the books of the, what's the name? Pentateuch. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch. And that covers all of this. But God gave to Moses a written law to fulfill a promise that he had made to this man. I'll make of you a great nation. And you're, in other passages other than Genesis 12, 1 through 3, he shows that your seed will be as the sands of the seashore. And, you know, we've talked about the fact that he was going to have to sacrifice Isaac. That would have presented a real dilemma in his mind. I put these 3 generations right here together. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right. But then the character that takes so much space in the latter part of Genesis is this man, Joseph, and a chronicle of his life, more or less. Because, and that's where we were the last time we had talked about him, and he had been sold down into Egypt and gained great favor and led the Egyptians in a lot of ways because he was in effect their prime minister, or he was second in command. And things went well as long as all respected and remembered what Joseph and his people had done for the Egyptians. But as we asked these last 2 questions here, we talked about the fact that the Egyptians were fearful of these people, the Israelites, living in their land, and they were afraid that enemies might come in and they would join them. So they treated them harshly. They made slaves of them, and they treated them more like we would think of the word slave. Servants, there's the word servant and there's the word slave. There's both kinds found throughout the Bible. Even in New Testament times, there was servants or slaves, in effect. People were sold into bondage, you might say. I'll work for you. I'll work for you the rest of my life. You just take care of me. Or they might have been sold to others and have to serve out a certain number of years of bondage and so on. And if you really want to see the background of this nation, it's not too far different. There was the African slave trade, the triangular trade, the Northeast with their shipping concerns went to Africa with their ships, picked up loads of slaves there from natives who sold each other, brought them back to the West Indies and on up into the South where their labor could be used because they were not an educated people, but they could be used for farmhands and so on. There they picked up cotton and goods grown in the South and went back to New England states, and your triangle just kept going. So there's no difference. In essence, people have been doing that all down through the years. We think, I guess, God and all of the blessings of this nation that we've gotten rid of that sort of stuff in this country nowadays. But that's what was going on down in Egypt. And we'll use the term or the amount of years 400. That's not exactly correct in all biblical studies, but they were in slavery 400 years, or down in the land of bondage, we'll put it that way. In the land of bondage, 400 years. 70 or 75 people went down there, and it's figured that when they came out of bondage, there was between 2 and 3 million probably of them came out 400 years later. So they had done well even under adverse conditions. Moses was a fine child and they didn't want to comply with the order that he be killed, so they hid him. And finally, they put him in an ark, which would have been a little basket probably made of woven grass or woven grain of some sort, and muddied in so that it would float on the water. And they put that child on the water where they knew that the Pharaoh's daughter and her attendants would be down where she was bathing in the Nile River. And the sister, Miriam, evidently was hidden in the bulrushes or hidden in the bushes, as we would say it nowadays, watching. So the Pharaoh's daughter saw the child and loved the child and wanted the child, and lo and behold, Miriam comes up and said, I know a woman to take care of that baby for you. I know one of these slave women over here that'll take care of the baby. Well, you get her. And Moses was suckled and cared for by his mother. All right. By his mother. So he was raised by his mother. Now, here, that movie, The Ten Commandments, will give you some wrong impressions. So far as the Bible's concerned, you have to realize that evidently Moses knew all along that he was a Hebrew, but that he belonged in that household of Pharaoh because Pharaoh's daughter had, in effect, adopted him, and she used a slave, his mother, to take care of him. So he grew up that way. This man Moses did. In the household of royalty, raised in royalty with the finest of accommodations, yet his mother and all his people were slaves. The first 40 years of his life were in that household. That's in Pharaoh's household. And we'll just go ahead and divide his life into 3 40s. The next 40 years was spent where? In what land? Midian. Now, that Midian would have been, the Bible calls it Midian, been back down in here where the Mount Sinai is. Here's Mount Sinai. He left, went down in here. All right. The last 40 years, he lived 120 years. The last 40 years of Moses' life was wilderness. All right. Wilderness wanderings. All right. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I'll go ahead while I'm covering that particular phase of this. He took 80 years of apprenticeship to do this great job. Most of us today at 80 years old, we're ready to go to the grave, or we're already there. 80 years of training, let's say. This first 40 years gave him experience from a standpoint of the best education that could be gotten anywhere in the land because of his position, gave him authority as would be gained in a household of the Pharaoh, gave him stature and respect. This next 40 years gave him humility. He went into the land of Midian, exiled from his country, and spent that time as a shepherd, tending sheep. What could be any more lonely and lowly in essence, or not bad when you speak of lowly, but humble than out caring for the sheep, and a patient job. So he had 80 years, and then God came to him and said, Moses, I want you to go back and get my people and lead them out. All right, so we get, that's as far as we need to go right now. But remember that division there and the way things worked out. Now back to Moses being born and put into the household of the Pharaoh. There he was raised and lived the first 40 years knowing that he was Israelite. And one day while out riding or out moving around among where his brethren were working, making bricks and so on, he saw something that made him so angry that he did what? All right, he killed a taskmaster, an Egyptian taskmaster, because they were mistreating the Hebrew slaves. And then he came back, and his own brethren, the Hebrews, were afraid of him because they thought he might do that to him too. So they didn't really accept him all that well. But as a result of that, his relations were broken with the household of Pharaoh, and he left for fear of his life. He was exiled, in effect, we could call it. And he went across out of Egypt over into this wilderness down in here, and he came to the vicinity of Mount Sinai, which is down in this area right here. All that land is not worth much up in here. The 1967 war, when the Jews pushed the Egyptians back across the Suez Canal, they didn't care about keeping this. You know, they gave all this land back to them here 3 or 4 years ago because it wasn't worth keeping. Nobody lives there much. Well, it's always been harsh, that desert area. And he went down through this area, and he came upon some ladies that were being mistreated where their sheep was being watered. And he took his staff, or his stick that he was walking with probably, and fought off the men and said, let the ladies and their sheep come in here and be watered, and let them water their flocks. All right, that showed that he didn't like the downtrodden, of course. And there was 7 of these ladies in that family. They had, maybe all of them were marriageable, I don't know. But one of them's name was Zipporah, Zipporah, I guess, or something like that. Zipporah. If that's not right, then you tell me how when you look it up. That woman was one of the 7 daughters of somebody? Jethro. I'll just put this up here. He figures prominently later when they're coming back through that area leading God's people out. All right. He married Zipporah and stayed there in this wilderness right here, the land of Midian, tending sheep for 40 years. And one day at the base of Mount Sinai, again, it's right in this area right here, base of Mount Sinai, he saw a strange thing on the mountain there. He says there's a bush that's burning, but it does not consume itself. It doesn't burn up the way we'd say it. Burning, but it just keeps on burning. I'll go there and see what that's all about. He came close to the bush, and the voice said, what? Yeah, take off your shoes or your sandals. You're on holy ground. God was speaking to him from the burning bush. And Moses, of course, was like anybody else. I guess he was scared to start with. I would have been. But God told him that I want you to lead my children out of uh, Egyptian bondage. And Moses said, what? He tried to back out, didn't he? Give excuses. I can't talk very well. He said, that's all right. I'll let you have, as your spokesman, your brother Aaron. Aaron will take care of that. Took that excuse away from him just that quick. Well, they won't pay much attention to me. I've been out over here for 40 years in the wilderness. I'm paraphrasing a little bit of this, but God asked him, what you got in your hand? That staff. He said, throw it on the ground. And he threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. He said, now pick the snake up by the tail. And it became a staff again. He's showing him that he could cause things to happen for Moses. And he said, now put your hand in your bosom and take it out. It was leprous. Now put it back in again and take it out. And it was clean. God was the power behind Moses. So he took every excuse that Moses tried to make away from him. I've given you a job, but you go on over there and do it. If you think you can't talk, your brother will talk for you. And if you think you don't have power, I'm with you. I'll just show you. And he gave him 2 or 3 examples there. So Moses left to go over into Egypt, the place where he had been run out of, in effect. Now, he had a couple of sons while he was over in here. Eliezer and Gershom, I guess it is. Somebody might look that up. And when he went back, he looked up his brother Aaron, and Aaron went with him before the Pharaoh. And he made appearances before the Pharaoh each time saying, let my people go. God has said that, let my people go. Now I want you to turn to Exodus, because we're about ready to leave the patriarchal dispensation. Now the book of Genesis, we've come all the way through it. Book of Genesis means what? The beginnings. Now the Exodus means the going out. And that's the reason they got that particular name. The very word means going out. Now, along about the 9th, 8th, 7th chapters, somewhere along there, the 8th chapter. Maybe it starts in the 7th chapter. All right. If you'll follow along, if you've got a Bible that has headings at the top, you can see these plagues. All right. Moses said, God told me to tell you to let my people go. And here, thank you. When that, each time Pharaoh would harden his heart and he wouldn't do it. And these plagues would come upon them because they didn't do it. So all I want you to remember specifically, of course I think you should read the whole thing in case you hadn't read it in recent years to refresh your mind of it. But do remember something about the fact that there was 10 plagues. The first one was the waters turned to blood. That was the Nile River, and all the waters in Egypt turned to blood. And you could just imagine trying to get you a drink of water and you drinking blood. And that would have been terrible. If you went to wash your hands, you'd be washing your hands in blood. And the next one was frogs, just thousands of frogs everywhere. And if you think mosquitoes can be bad sometimes, well, just imagine stepping on frogs and having them everywhere. About 7 or 8 years ago, I saw a picture on television of a place in Australia, I believe it was, where they had an infestation of frogs, and you could see them jumping up against the door at the houses, and every time they opened the door, they'd jump in, and There were so many of them, you step on them, the cars run over them, the slippery and the slimy and all that sort of stuff. You can imagine frogs in your bed and everything else. And then the plague of lice. Well, we got lice with us nowadays. They get in schools and around, and they're aggravating. People really go to all means to get rid of them. It's a parasite, and they're horrible if there's just lice all over everything. And then flies. Flies are bad enough when they're in normal condition, but if you had them just all over everything, it would be terrible. Murrain of the cattle, or disease and sickness of the cattle that would kill them. Plague of boils. You don't hear the word boils much anymore in medical terms because they classify things in other ways. But there used to be a song when I was a child about old Black Joe or something like that. He died with a carbuncle on his heel, and he had boils here and boils there and things like that. But boils, even up to 50 years ago, were spoken of as eruptions of the skin and all sorts of problems. And then the plague of hail and lightning, hail, and fire. And you think, well, how could that be so bad? But if it just continued to fall and just piled up all over everything, and fire dancing around all over the place with lightning. And then the plague of locusts. Now, locusts is about like grasshoppers. Some people in some countries eat locusts or grasshoppers, but you wouldn't want them all over everywhere. Now, in our west, in this country, we have had plagues of grasshoppers. And I don't know whether they've ever been in Nebraska, where one of our members, was there ever any plagues in where you were?
No, I don't think so.
On out further west, there has been. They had one in Utah in the last century. You remember they tell the tale of all the birds, the seagulls coming in and eating the locusts and saving them from the plague of the locusts. But they still have them in certain parts of Africa and in this Holy Land area over there, and they still have plagues of locusts or grasshoppers. When they move through an area, they'll just eat up everything that's green. And then the thick darkness. And after the thick darkness, the last plague was threatened. Now, this thick darkness, I'd like to tell you something about that. We had a demonstration one time here that I attended by General Electric. It was a demonstration at a speech given by a man from General Electric to the Instrument Society of America. And they had the doors fixed so that no light could come in. And it was at a restaurant over here on O Street at the time. And at the given time, he had a light bulb under a box, and he had a pinhole stuck in it. I mean, literally a pinhole stuck in it. They had carefully prepared that room so that no light could get in from any other place. And he cut the lights off. And it just as dark as pitch. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see your hands in front of you. And there was no moonlight, no nothing, except that little pinhole. And he said, everybody be quiet for a couple of minutes. And then he said, what are all of you looking at? It is obvious. Everybody's looking at that pinhole because there was a little bit of light. He said, that just demonstrates how much man has to have light, and that he will search for it. Of course, the Bible talks about light, too. In Chattanooga, on Lookout Mountain, they take you down deep into the ground at a place called Ruby Falls, and then they cut all the lights off. And it's horrifying. Some people would just about scream, they say, because it's total darkness. Well, here's a plague of total darkness. That would be enough to cause problems. All these things would cause problems. And all these things had to do in one way or the other with things that some of the Egyptians worshipped or respected greatly. Murrain of the cattle, for instance, a lot of them worshiped cows. And they worshiped the Nile, turned that water to blood, and all sorts of things like that. But finally, and I want to get this before the bell rings, the last plague was, if you don't let my people go, all of the firstborn in every household will die when the death angel comes over. Now, the Israelites were to be spared. They're here in the land of Goshen, right in here, or on the bigger map over in here. Here in the land of Goshen. And when the death angel came over, their children, or the firstborn, would not die. They had to kill what's called a paschal lamb, or a lamb without spot and without blemish, and that ought to bring to mind the type and antitype. Christ said Christ went to the cross as a lamb. He was without sin, without spot, or without blemish. All right, back here, when God's people were being brought out of that land, they killed this paschal lamb and took the blood and sprinkled it up on the doorpost and the lintels. That's all around the doorpost and the frames and so on. And when the death angel came over, if the death angel saw the blood, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. We sing the song. That's what happened. The Pharaoh had hardened his heart and wouldn't even go for that, wouldn't let him go. And the firstborn and all the households, that meant of the stock too, of the animals. Firstborn died of those and so on. So there was weeping and all sorts of problems in all households, and that so stirred them up that all the people said, get those folks out of here. In fact, we'll give them gold trinkets. We'll give them anything. Get them on out of here. So they gave them all the gold they could get and said, take this and go. And they had all sorts of things coming out with them. Pharaoh turned them loose and let them go finally because of that. But even then, after they had gone, his heart again was hardened, and he went after them. And he caught up to them over at the Red Sea. We would figure that, you see, nowadays there's a Suez Canal through there. But the top part of the Red Sea there was where they would have gone across.